Hey, welcome back to the next episode of Mixed Together. Since the last episode actually went on a trip to the beach, so I've been away from this mix for over a week. So I'm going to dive back in and kind of pick up where I left off. But another thing you should know, I'm the kind of guy who likes to start things and then evaluate them and course correct. So instead of keeping these videos all around 20 minutes, I'm going to make this one a little bit longer, which you already know because you're watching the video and you saw how long it is. But for the however many more videos it takes, I'm going to take a bit more time in the videos and try to get more accomplished with each one. So instead of 12 videos, maybe this will just be 8 or something like that. So each of these videos will be a little bit longer, a little more like a mixing course where I'm just walking through it with you. The bite-sized videos, I've got other videos I want to make for you, and I'd rather get this one done sooner than later. So right now, we just finished up in the last episode doing the drums, and a lot of you commented that the tambourines weren't terribly in time, which I'm sure is true, and we will deal with that or mute them or something. We won't leave it in there bad. And some of you were asking why not just get the tempo or figure out the tempo and then snap to grid. That is a valid approach. If you want to tap the tempo in or use Beat Detective in Pro Tools or something like that to figure out the tempo, that's fine. I wanted to show you that while all of that is good, with just the basic editing tools, we can fix the timing parts in these drums. You don't have to go all fancy to make it work. It took an extra 2 minutes to kind of figure out exactly where it goes, but then I was done versus spending, some people might spend an hour just trying to tempo map the song when you really just needed to get this one section fixed. Okay, so anyway, we've done that, and where did we leave off? I think I put a handful of plugins on the drums. I think that's it. So we've done our static mix, and we started kind of going through figuring out what's next, I guess. So let me just hit play for a minute and kind of familiarize myself. We'll go with this last chorus, which is where I like to hang out, get this biggest part of the song feeling good, and then we'll move back. But let me just hit play and listen for a minute and regather my thoughts. Okay, so just in case you forgot, you know what? Hold on, I gotta change a setting. Loop follow selection. Let me turn that off. It keeps looping when I click on other stuff. So you may recall from the last video, for the next little while, I've got vocals muted. So we're just getting a good instrumental mix. You'll hear some people say, depending on the style of music, but some people just like to start with vocals. And I completely understand the concept of get an amazing vocal sound and then blend everything on top of it. I've just never liked working that way. It feels weird to work on a vocal in a cappella because inevitably you make the vocal full and have a lot of like mid-range and low end because that's what sounds nice a cappella. Then you add guitars and bass, and now the vocal feels muddy because it's got too much mid-range that probably should be occupied on the bass. Flip that around, you've probably heard stories like this of big major label mix sessions where they spend 2 days, I've heard this specific story, they spent 2 days trying to get the lead vocal sound right, and they finally ended up making it. When you soloed it by itself, it sounded thin and brittle and awful, but then when you dropped it into the mix, it sounded perfect. Now, that's not always the case, depends on the style of music, obviously, but generally speaking, the vocal in a mix that I'm finished with, the lead vocal in solo doesn't sound as amazing as you might expect it to, because nobody's listening to it in solo. We're going to listen to it in context of the mix. So usually a thinner vocal will actually end up working super well. So that's why I don't start with a vocal. I feel like it's easier, even though vocals are challenging and pose their own big, unique set of problems, I'd much rather get a great instrumental and then make the vocal fit on top of that rather than starting with the vocal. That's just my personal preference. Do what you want. But also, I just enjoy, vocals take more work. Like the raw vocals right now, there's nothing wrong with them. It's just they need work, and I don't want to work on vocals yet. I want to work on drums, bass, and guitars. So just having them muted out means I don't have to listen to that and listen over them to get all the drums and bass stuff right. So here we go. Feel good about the drum balance. I like the kind of overall EQ that we've done. We cut a little boxiness, we boosted some lows, and a little bit of that kind of, a little bit of the clarity at about a little under 5K, and then we've got the compressor acting about 3 dB of gain reduction. One thing I like to, so obviously you don't mix with your eyes, right? But getting visual feedback is a super helpful kind of backup or second opinion to kind of make sure you're in the ballpark. So for example, when I set the balance for these drums just without any plugins, that's what I had it sound like. That felt pretty good to me. It felt pretty balanced. And then when I added the compression and EQ, check out what the needle's doing here on the compressor. So first off, we're not doing tons of compression. It's really just hitting 3 dB. But the other thing that I'm looking for is I want to make sure that the kick drum and the snare drum are hitting about the same. So if the kick makes the compressor jump way over here and then the snare barely hits the compressor, to me, 9 times out of 10, that's a little bit of a red flag. It means my kick is just too loud, and I'm going to be fighting that the entire mix. If it's way too loud, you start to have pumping in the mix because it's causing the mix bus compressor to pump in addition to everything else. And we're just, I don't know about you, but I'm wired to, I like a big beefy low end in my mix, so which means a big kick drum and a big bass. But if you overdo it, you can trick yourself into thinking, hey, this sounds great with a kick drum that's 10 dB louder than everything else, and it takes you a long time to realize, okay, I need to dial that back. So one thing I like to do is, one of the reasons why I like putting the bus compressor on before I start compressing the individual tracks is it gives me a visual. Once I get a decent amount of compression happening, if the kick is making it come to 3 and then the snare is making it come to around the same place, then I feel like kick and snare are at good levels. You can do that with a meter without a compressor, but this to me is a little more, it tells me I'm on the right track. So there's maybe a little more compression with the kick than the snare, but it's not huge, right? We're all in this 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction range. That gives me just, if I'm getting ready to go move on to other things with the drums, I will quickly look at that meter on my drum bus and just make sure, okay, one particular piece of the kit isn't causing a massive amount of compression compared to the rest. It helps me kind of check myself before I wreck my mix. Okay, so let's listen now and let's determine what we want to do next. So there's plenty to address here, and I'm not sure where I want to start just yet. So let me just hit play and listen and see what stands out to me. Okay, one big thing is I'm still getting a lot of like kind of boxy sort of room sound. And when I muted the room mic or the room bus, a lot of that went away. So if you recall from one of the last videos, I got rid of the close room mic and I'm just using the far room and the mono room together pretty evenly. I'm gonna see if I can just get the sound I want from the room mic bus. So both combined. We already did some EQ here to get rid of some of that boxiness. You can hear it here. But there's still just some kind of grossness that makes it feel less clear altogether. Listen to how clear it is without the rooms. And then listen to the low end of the kick and the snare. They both have some nice beef to them. I like that. It's partially just because of the tracks. It's partially because of the the little EQ boost we have on the mix bus. We boosted the low end at like 100 hertz. That's helping us a little bit as well. So, but then we add in the rooms, and it just feels like it adds a lot of kind of muddiness to it. Now, I love the energy that it adds. That's a ton of energy. Like, it's completely transformed the drum sound, and I love it. But I think down here is unnecessary. I don't think we need all of this. So my first instinct is to just try to roll off the low end. Sometimes you want some beefiness in the room mics. It kind of adds to the character, but honestly, you still get some pretty cool sounds, even if you get rid of all the low mids and the lows. This still, I haven't heard it yet, but I'm going to guess this still sounds pretty cool and vibey. No, it doesn't. That's too much. Let's pull back a little bit. Maybe 145 and below. Could probably get away with bringing it up even a little more. So it still sounds like the room mic, but listen to what the difference. We've just gotten rid of some of the rumble that really isn't helping us. Now, depending on how you're approaching this mix, if you're going more like kind of an indie rock vibe where the bulk of your overall drum tone is coming from like the overhead in the rooms, then you may not want to do that kind of EQ. If you're going for just these as your sound, which is a legitimate approach, just kind of that more muffled, woofy kick drum sound, woo-ka, woo-ka, that's legit. Like, you know, this isn't a great example, but remember the first Ray LaMontagne record? It sounds like all the drums were recorded with just a room mic or overheads or something. There's no clarity anywhere, and it made for a cool vibe. I just had lunch with my friend Brent Milligan yesterday, and he was talking about a track he recorded for the band Colony House and how he intentionally recorded the drums badly, like using a couple of really old, weird mics in some interesting positions so that the mix engineer would have to mix it differently and make this vibe. And it was a really risky thing, and I haven't even heard the mixes yet. But that, if you're going for that, great. You've got a bunch of room mics to choose from and overheads, and you can get a cool sound. For this song, though, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. This is more straightforward. We're rocking. We need to hear the kick and the snare. Just as an example, let me mute out all the spot mics and just have overhead and rooms, and listen to how there's just no way to get the kick and the snare to cut through these bass and guitars. That balance, I brought them down a little bit. You could hear the kick and the snare. It just wasn't not right for this style of music. So that said, let's I'm sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot today. I'm just a little bit hyper. I've had too much coffee. The reason I tell you that is in some instances you want the low end and the room mic, and that's great. In this one, I don't think we do. Let's go back and listen to the drums, and I'll just kick on this low pass or this high pass filter, low cut, and just listen to how it's going to most likely clean up the drums quite a bit. Not a huge difference, but it feels like we freed up some low-end real estate that we can use for kick drum and bass later. I also wonder if we can adjust this EQ a little bit to kind of get more of that roomy sound, that boxiness that's there. And I don't know if this is necessary, but I just took, what is that? It's 4.38K. It's the frequency we boosted in the drums, if you recall, on the drum bus. There's a little, I don't really tend to want a lot of cymbals in my room mics if I can help it. And that's one reason why we didn't pick the close room mic track. We just turned it down altogether. Here, I'm just finding the most obnoxious part of the cymbals. And just bringing it down a little bit. It darkens up the rooms a little bit. We still hear the room sound of the snare and all that, but it's not quite as obnoxious because we've got plenty of overhead, or plenty of cymbals in the overheads. And they're a lot cleaner and tighter and a little more controlled. So with these together, drums are sounding pretty good. There's still a frequency in the rooms I don't love. Listen to the snare. Ga, da, 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 da. Let's see if we can notch that out. It's a little annoying to me. You hear that note? That's at 353 hertz. That may not be the right one, but it's some sort of resonance happening in the room that really likes the snare drum. So if we take that and pull it down, it should make the snare feel a little tighter. I mean, I don't know if that. Let's listen to it with the hold the drums. I could just be lying to myself, which, if we're being honest, that's a big part of mixing, is you just lie to yourself the whole time. But I think it made a little bit of a difference. If not, I've just talked myself into liking that sound. So we're gonna keeping it real and honest here. We're gonna leave that for now. So the biggest thing I'm hearing now, kick and snare could use some work. But the thing to keep in mind as we move forward, if you're going to get a bulk of your tone from something like room mics, then you need to have them in play when you're working on the kick and the other spot mics, because this is what the kit sounds like without the rooms. That's nice, but that's not our drum sound. Our drum sound necessarily needs these room mics. That's kind of our sound, right? So, in order to get the kick drum sound we want, we don't need to spend a lot of time listening to it like this. We can do that a little bit, but ultimately we got to listen to it with everything, or at least with the rooms in play. Okay, so what I'm going to do real quick is just to listen to the kick specifically. What do we want to change, if anything? It's kind of just indistinct. It's got a lot of mid-range. It's got some low end, but not a lot of clarity. Let's listen to it by itself just to analyze it. Pretty good. So I'm gonna use, let's get a fat channel over here. Paging Dr. Fat Channel. Okay, and yeah, that EQ will work. Let's use this one. And I'm just gonna, while listening to the overall kit, I'm gonna try to just figure out a way to make this kick drum work a little bit better. Thinking it's gonna take a little bit of a boost up here to get a little more snap out of it. Probably a little bit of mid-range cut further to make it really not have that boxiness that's there. Let's just see what happens. That's the annoying frequency. We already cut this frequency on our drum bus, and we may need to use a different EQ so we're not cutting the exact same 360 hertz, but I kind of like the EQs like this because it just gives me a couple of options, so I don't spend a lot of time waffling between 350 and 360. I just choose 360 and go. But when I boost this, the kick drum sounds pretty disgusting. So we agree that's disgusting. Let's cut that and see if it improves things. I think it did, but now we need some low end. Let's do a little boost. Again, this is a shelf, so it's boosting everything below these frequencies. I'll switch around and see which one makes sense. That feels good. Now, if I can get a little more snap out of it, and we're EQing the kick bus, by the way. I could certainly EQ the individual tracks, but, the whole backwards mixing thing. A lot of people say, and I've done this before, I say boost around 1K for that snap that you want. But I found actually I get more mileage out of boosting somewhere in the 4, usually this one. This is just under 5K, gives me more of that tick, tick, tick of the kick drum that I want. So I obviously don't need to boost it that much, but let me boost it just enough to where we hear that tick a little bit more. Now you may think 9 dB is too much. It just is what it is. I think it works. That feels better if we bypass this plug-in and go back and forth. Let's see how the kick drum changes. Does it improve or not? I say it does. It's not amazing yet, but it's a good first step. It's a little clearer. It's a little bit louder, honestly, but that's a part of what we're doing here. Now, there's other resonance of the kick drum that I'm hearing. Let's find it. Is it in the rooms? Okay, let me invite you into what I'm doing. I've muted the kick drums. I'm trying to figure out where this kind of, the kick happens, boom, and then there's this kind of woo resonance that's happening afterward. It's a little bit on the kick track itself. No, it's not at all. It's happening somewhere else in the room, but I don't think it's the room mic. So basically, I'm going to keep muting things until that sound disappears. So real quick, listen so you can hear what I'm listening for. You hear that hoo, hoo, hoo. I'm not sure where it is. It is in the snare mic. Is it in the tom mics? Let's just mute things out till it disappears. We found our culprit. It is one of the tom mics. It disappeared when I muted the tom bus. Here are the toms by themselves. So, which of the tom? Is it all of them? It's the middle one. Now, there's a lot of bleed on the toms, and you can certainly 100% make a case for going in and cutting out all the parts of the toms where there are no toms playing. That's legit. You can either gate the toms, use a gate to just make them quieter when they're not being played. I prefer, if I'm going to do that, just to come in here and just to literally chop things up and say, there's no tom here, and delete. I may do that, but I don't like, so a lot of people say, Joe, why didn't you do that on this song if they see a mix of mine? Or Joe, why did you do that on this song? Because sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I'm a big fan of only doing things that need to be done. if you're in the habit of taking 30 minutes to go perfectly cut out every non-tom hit on your tom tracks, that's great. But two things. One, was there enough bleed that it was actually causing a problem in the whole mix when you listened to everything? Or was it only something you heard when you soloed the drums? Or was it only something you heard when you soloed that particular tom track? That's an important question, because otherwise you're just being busy for the sake of being busy. You're not actually helping the song. A lot of times, in my experience, the more I learn to leave things alone, the better results I get. I also can get faster results, which is a whole separate thing. The second reason I don't do it by default every time is sometimes I get a really great vibe from just having the toms in play. So they almost act like an extra room mic or an extra overhead, where they just give me a little more snare sound, a little more kick sound, a little more room sound that adds to the vibe of the song. So I don't want to be quick to cut those out. That's very dependent on the song and the style of music and yada, yada, yada. But those are the two reasons why I don't automatically cut it out, and why even now, when I realize there's a tom problem, we got ourselves a tom problem, that I'm not going to just immediately start cutting out the toms. It could be a simple one EQ fix, which I'm kind of suspecting it is, and then I can do that, take 10 minutes to explain it, take 1 minute to fix it, and move on. So I'm going to take a normal EQ here because I need to be fairly surgical. And I'm going to solo the tom for a second, and we're going to find the offending frequency and remove it. Hopefully it doesn't affect the tone of the tom itself. It just causes it not to resonate with that kick drum as much. Let's see. Now, I love doing this type of work. You can easily go overboard, but I like to go in, get a pretty narrow Q, which is width control. With the higher the number, the more narrow it is, and then start to really slowly sweep it up and back. So in different DAWs and plugins are different. With Studio One, as I'm sweeping this control, if I hold down Shift, it'll just go one frequency at a time. So I can really find the very center of that frequency versus just doing a cut close to it. We might as well find the exact frequency and cut it out. That way we can still leave the adjacent frequencies there for the big beefy tom sound that we're going to want later. Little tip, you know when you're there when the sound has a longer tail to it. So it's going doom, 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 doom. It's just ringing for days. We found it, and now just cut that sucker like crazy. My buddy Tim Horsley, who plays drums on tons of my stuff, he does this a lot. Like early, like when we're tracking it, we'll find some ringing frequencies in the snare drum. Once we've got a good snare mic placement, if there's still some ring we want to take care of, we'll go do it right then and there before we even record, so we don't have to listen to it anymore. So this is very valuable, very easy to overdo, so know what you're trying to accomplish before you start, or you'll go down a rabbit trail and you'll come up an hour later and have completely jacked up your drums. So let's see how this sounds once we cut it. Now, that worked really well. We cut it by like 18 dB. Now let's go find a spot. Which tom are we on? This one? Let's go find a spot where the tom is being played. Guess what? That still sounds like a tom. That still has lots of frequencies to work with. We just took one little sliver of frequencies, and the tom still sounds great. Barely changes the tone of the tom itself, but when the tom is not playing, we don't get that kick drum resonance. There's still a little bit of bleed, but that resonance is what I was hearing before. So now if we open up everything but the kick drums, we should sound a lot cleaner. Just to emphasize the point, let me turn this EQ off so you can hear it. Again, we're listening to everything but the kick drums. Boom, boom, boom. That's going to disappear when I click this plugin back on. Now we're just left with big, beefy, glorious low end in small doses, and then we add the kick drum back in, and we're just off to the races. maybe a smidge too much low end. Let's rein that back a little bit. And a lot of times on kick drums, I'll roll off the really, really low stuff because it's not really helping us out here. Now, I have a sneaky suspicion, just based on I've messed up drums so many times in the past, that the kick drum might be a little too loud after the EQ that we've done. It sounds too loud. I could just adjust it, but let's just check our handy-dandy meter over here. Yeah, some of the louder kick hits are getting a little more compression than they were before. So the only problem with some of these analog EQs like this is if you do a lot of boosting, you've increased the volume and there's no like output gain, which would be nice. It'd be nice if this whole plugin just had an extra knob here to turn down the overall volume. PreSonus, if you're watching, could you add that? Would that be that difficult? Or we can just do it ourselves by turning down the fader, or we could even put like the mix tool plugin here that has a volume knob on it. That seems a little much. I'm just going to turn the fader down just a smidge. Very cool. Now I want to turn my attention to the snare drum. It sounds okay. Very rarely can I, not rarely, some of the times I can get, especially if it was recorded well and they captured it well, and even if they put some like EQ and compression on the snare track as they were recording it, they may already capture the sound that we want. But typically a very dry and simple, just the sound of a snare drum with a microphone in front of it isn't usually the sound that we want in a mix. The sound we're used to hearing, the sound we like, is typically the more compressed sound of the snare. Now we're already getting some compression at this drum bus, but now I want to probably do some of that and a little bit of EQ on the actual track itself. So my doorbell just rang, so let me go check that. And I'm back. Does it feel like time travel? Because I was gone for like 10 minutes. Okay, so I've decided 33 minutes into the video or whatever, that I'm going to finish the drum mix in this video. So stick with me. So where were we? We were looking at the snare drum, talking about how typically the sound that you love in your snare drum mixes is typically the sound of some compression and EQ there, but specifically compression does something fun to the snare drum. So here's what we got. Listen specifically to the snare. Sounds pretty good to me. Sounds like a snare drum. I'd like to see if we can get a little less. So right now it sounds a little amateur. It just sounds like a couple microphones on a kit. So we got a little bit of room sound there that I'm okay with. That's going to get drowned out a little bit in the mix. How's the snare sound in the overheads? It's killer overhead sound. It might be even too wide. We'll deal with that later. How's the snare sound in the toms? There's a lot of bleed in those tom tracks. We may end up cutting them out after all. But here's our main snare sound. So one thing I like to do when since I do so much kind of, got one hand in both camps, I've got some processing happening on the drum bus. I've got some processing potentially happening on the individual tracks. And even here, we've got a snare bus with two mics feeding into it that one of those may need some attention. I like to go, and the thing that I'm working on, and this works kind of across the board, works well with bass, really with anything in the instrumental mix. When you're about to work on it, if you're not sure what it needs, mute out the track itself. So especially for drums like snare drum, when we mute the snare, are we losing a ton of sound, or are we not? Meaning, are we getting the bulk of our snare tone from the overhead and rooms, or are we getting a lot of it from the spot mic? I honestly don't know, but if we don't answer that question, we could go in and start EQing and compressing this snare like crazy, and it's not really affecting the overall sound. So let's hit play, and then I'll mute out the snare, spot mics, and see what, if anything, changes. So there's still that ka, ka, ka sort of sound coming through the room mics. We may go in and address that some more. I want to leave that alone for a minute because I think my gut is once you add in bass and guitars, that's not going to be as big of a problem. That little ringing ka sound it's not the loudest thing in the overhead track, so I don't want to start going crazy on EQing. I'm sorry, I keep saying overhead, the room track. Now that I said that real quick, what frequency did we cut? Oops, undo. What frequency did we cut here? I think instead of, I'm going to move this one. I don't think maybe that's the frequency to cut. It was at 353. It may be. I'll copy that to my clipboard just in case I want to come back. But I think it's higher. Listen with me real quick. It's up higher, somewhere up there. So this is one where maybe notching it didn't help, and just finding this kind of group of frequencies around 500-600 hertz is where it's just kind of giving me, there's just kind of a bundle of frequencies there that are getting really excited every time the snare drum hits. I need to find those and cut them, and I think they're here with a little bit wider Q. Yeah, that excites me. I don't know if that made a lot of sense, if you could kind of get what I'm going for there, but let me just turn off the EQ on the rooms entirely. So this is just the rooms we're listening to. Do you hear how the snare drum, there's just a lot of kind of wah, 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 in that range, frequencies that are really, they're kind of out of balance. They're louder than everything else to my ear. So when the snare hits, there's this excitement of frequencies. So in addition to that and removing a lot of the low end, we're really making this room sound. We're getting all the good qualities of the room without some of that bad resonant stuff that was happening. So let me hit play, and then I'll turn the EQ on in a second, and you can hear the big difference this EQ is making it into, from a pretty great sounding room track into a great sounding room track. So it's hard to hear the whole difference, but to me, the snare drum, by figuring out that EQ, even though I said I wasn't going to mess with it, that made the overall snare sound. The overall snare sounds better. Now, let's address the individual snare drum because we can probably get a little more presence out of it. So the big thing you'll find is you may get to this point in the mix and say, hey, that snare sounds good, let's move on. Then you go over here and you bring in your bass and guitars and you say, something like, oh, I can't hear my snare anymore. And you go back. So knowing that's going to happen, snare will always get lost, or the tracks will try to drown out the snare. I'm going to try to do a couple of things on the snare track just to give it, to me, the way I process drums, this way at least, in songs like this, the snare spot mics themselves are really just that crisp initial attack of the snare, and then the overall tone comes from the overhead in the rooms. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch. So let's listen to the snare by itself just for a second. Let me get rid of that ring just because I want to. You hear it at ooh, ooh, ooh. So that's just on the top mic. Is that going to make a big difference in the overall drum sound? Probably not, but if I do compress this snare, it's going to bring that ring out more, so I'd rather get rid of it before we go there. All right, now I'm going to bring the fat channel in just to my overall snare sound. And yeah, let's just go 1176. So snare drum, I find, responds pretty well to faster attack times. And this sort of Fet Comp 1176 style compressor tends to do that. Like there is no slow attack time on this. It goes from fast to stupid fast, or one way or the other. Which one's faster? 0.8 is slower than 0.02. Anyway, so I start messing with that a little bit because it's all a fast attack time, and then keep the release pretty quick so it gives up the sound pretty quickly. But let's just mess around a little bit, see what we can come up with. I'm going to pull this back. I'm going to do this in context of the entire drum mix because that's really what matters. Couple things are happening. One, I kind of like the way the snare's going, but there's this weird EQ thing that's happening. When we compress the snare, we're bringing up the bleed in the kick drum. One of those frequencies needs to go. So I'm going to put an EQ here before the compressor, and we're going to figure that out. So the snare is just very snappy, very papery sort of sounding, but I kind of like that because it gives it some presence. I'm going to try to get a little more beef out of it. So I'm going to boost some of this just low-end stuff. I'll roll off a little bit of the really low stuff. But let's just see if we can make it sound beefy whilst also being snappy. So in this one, I cut around 700 hertz, which is a lot higher than that kind of low mid-range. So we boosted some lows, cut some of this frequency. That frequency up there is kind of where that resonates. I don't love any of those sounds, so I'm going to cut those a little bit, and that feels pretty good. It's kind of tight. It's got a little bit of a punch to it. We could probably crank the low end a little bit more. It feels pretty good. How's it sound, of course, in context? Okay, that's pretty cool. It's not a huge, amazing, dramatic difference, and that's what we all want to hear. But it is pretty cool what it's doing. So let me turn off the fat channel, and hit play, and we won't look at the plugin, we'll just listen. So when you see this little light go on, you'll know we've added compression and EQ to that snare drum. Just listen to what it's doing to the overall drum sound. It feels like the snare got closer without getting louder, which is kind of what we want. So when he plays ba-da-ba-da-bam, we can hear those and hear that kind of crispiness of it versus before. Okay, it's not that different. It's a little crispier. It's a little more in your face. And in general, the snare hits are a little easier to hear. Are we done with the snare sound? No, I'm sure when we're working on guitars and bass, we'll decide the snare needs some more work. That's almost always the case, but I'm kind of happy with it for now. It still leaves, see, what I don't love, and this is total personal preference, is when you make a snare so thin that it's only brightness. That's fine. I like the snare to have a little meat to it. So if anything, right now the snare is a little too thick, but I like it. Because if I go too, one of the things you'll run into, if your mixes tend to be muddy for a season, then you'll go through a phase where, and my mixes have tended to be muddy in the past, it's kind of, that's where I tend to err. But then sometimes I overcorrect, and I'll end up taking out too much mid-range to where it's missing all the beef and the character that makes songs great. So usually when I pull on a reference track of some sort, the thing I always notice the most in my studio is they have more mid-range than I do. So I tend to let things stay a little more muddy to my ears because I know that's probably the right tonal balance for the song. So let's see how we're feeling about the drum mix now. Kick drum feels like it's all 100 hertz or all, well, it feels like it's all mid-range and we don't have a lot of deep low ends. I'm going to adjust this EQ on the kick drum, see if we can remedy that a little bit. Maybe too much, and it looks, if we used our eyes, we would say, no, that's too much. You can't possibly get a good sound boosting a 10.5 dB at 60 hertz. But there's not a lot of information down here. There's just a little bit of low end, and then we're rolling off everything below 37, so it's just a little area that we're boosting. So we have to boost it a lot to be able to hear it in this particular track, and that feels good to me. I may come back and adjust that, but I initially was feeling like the kick drum was a little weak. That made it feel a little better without boosting the mids and the highs that I didn't want more of. Now the overall kick volume might be a little much, so I'll pull down the fader just a little bit. There's still some muddiness. When I mute the kick, there's still some kind of wonkiness I hear in the mix. Okay, that feels good. I didn't do much other than just roll off a little more of the snare drum because it was getting some of that kick bleed. But that feels pretty good. Let's go to a spot where all those toms are doing their crazy thing. Is that here? There's a tom. He doesn't play tom 3 until the very end of the song, right here. Only time tom 3 gets played. Tom 1, not much. Tom 2 gets a lot of action. These toms sound pretty good. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to EQ. I'm going to use a basic EQ because the frequencies change every time. I'm going to take out some mid-range. I'm going to make them sound like little mini kick drums. I'm going to do it on the entire tom bus because I just don't care that much. It feels great to me. I mean, we're getting some sound from the direct toms. We're also getting some sound from the overheads in the rooms, and it feels good. I don't want to do much more to the toms than that. So yeah, I think I'm happy with the toms. So overheads, I go back and forth on overheads. A lot of people want to come in to overheads and they want to do something like this and this and this just by default. But these overheads really do sound great just by themselves. It doesn't feel unbalanced. I hear everything. I hear the cymbals. Actually, the only thing I hear on both on these overheads and also on less or so on the toms is they just feel a little bit wide. So I'm going to narrow them down. Studio One doesn't give me the option to just narrow the panning on the mixer itself, so I will use the binaural pan plugin just to go and bring it in so that it's not quite so wide. So those jumps from the cymbal crashes right, left, right, left. That feels more natural than having it hard right and hard left. I'm a big fan of LCR panning, but for drums, I almost always bring them in a little bit. And I'm going to use this on the toms as well. Even though he doesn't play the toms all that much, in the couple spots where he does, that tom to the left feels a little awkward. Versus this. Just feels a little more like they're all together. If you get the great drum sound up the middle and then these toms and cymbals come in from way out to the side, it just feels awkward. It doesn't feel like one cohesive unit. You want some width to them usually, but I don't like them to be that far out. Okay, so now I'm feeling pretty good. That feels pretty stinking good. How do we, let's just check the tambourine and shaker real quick. I literally spend as little time on these as possible. They're just tambourine and shaker. I don't EQ or even do anything unless it needs it. Yeah, the timing's not great on that one. What about this one? I don't love that either. So for now, I'm I'm gonna mute these. So when they're grayed out, they're muted. Let's check the shaker real quick. So, okay, we're gonna forego the percussion. Maybe we'll come back if we feel like we're missing it. I'm a big fan of percussion. I think a shaken tambourine can add a ton, and they've put them in here, but the timing is just not great. Listen to this section. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's actually pretty good there for a little bit, but it just gets off. And I wonder if it's adding much of anything. Tambo 1 felt worse to me. Also, this section, just from a production standpoint, this section is so cool drum-wise, it doesn't need tambourine. It's almost like you're distracting from the cool drum part by having that tambourine there. So that's another reason to get rid of it. Tambourine 2. It's just too loose for me, so I'm going to mute it for now. We may come back and try to fix it later. If we had the tempo and we wanted to just try to quantize it, we could. I would rather not, you know what I mean? And then shaker, I don't know if it's adding much here. It's not bad. I don't get a lot out of that, of thinking, oh man, that adds so much. Maybe later when we're mixing and we're listening through and we get to this section where it drops down to just acoustic guitars and vocals, we may say, man, we're missing that. But the drums are pretty killer on this. So unless it's adding, the percussion is adding a huge new thing that we're loving, unless that's the case, probably just need to get rid of it. It probably doesn't, it needs to serve a purpose. If it's enhancing the drums, great. If it's taking away from the drums or even covering up the drums, and the drums are already sounding really good, then I say let's get rid of it. So just to finish out the video, our drum mix is done for now. Let's pull in the guitars and bass and see how this thing sounds. So comparing to our static rough mix, the drums sound great. So we know we've done some good work there. They're clear, we can hear everything. We'll probably go back and make some changes, but it's not uncommon for me to spend a good 45 minutes to an hour on the drums just because they're so foundational, and then I've kind of fit everything else around the drum kit. So that's it for this video. We have mixed the drums. We'll move on to bass and guitars in the next one. We'll really get bass rocking, and then I may try something where I turn bass and drums down entirely and then work on the rest of the song for a while. I'm not sure if I'll do that yet. We'll find out in the next episode. Until then, if you haven't downloaded the tracks yet, they are yours for free. Just go to homestudiocorner.com/MT, enter your email address, and you can mix this song right along with me. Thanks for watching. See ya.